By the time Cynthia Vigil reached Darlene Breach's trailer on March 22, 1999, she had almost nothing left except momentum. She was naked. A metal collar was still locked around her neck, with a chain hanging from it. Blood was on her body. Breach would later remember a young woman in total panic, begging for help and trying to get the door shut before anyone could catch up to her. Vigil did not look like someone reporting a crime after the fact. She still looked like part of the crime scene. Vigil said she had escaped from a nearby property belonging to David Parker Ray near Elephant Butte Lake in southern New Mexico. Police were not being asked to reconstruct a vanished assault from rumor and delay. They were being pointed toward a place close enough to reach while the evidence was still there. They followed her back expecting one scene and a straightforward arrest. Instead, they found a property that had to be read in pieces. First came the obvious outline: a mobile home, a yard, another structure beside it. Then came the split inside that outline. One building looked like the visible part of a life. The other looked like the place that life had been steering toward. A woman had escaped from one building. The other building still sat there waiting to be entered. That mattered before officers could even inventory it. The layout suggested not one room inside one home, but a division between ordinary domestic space and a separate, more controlled site. Inside that trailer, contemporary reporting described restraints, sexual devices, surgical-style tools, videotapes, written instructions, and an audio recording prepared for captives. Some accounts also described a gynecological chair or table among the equipment. The point was not any single object. It was how quickly the room began explaining itself. Restraints sat beside devices. Recording equipment occupied the same space as tools for bodily control. The arrangement read less like chaos left behind than like a process interrupted. The walls carried that process further. Reporting from 1999 described homemade rules, diagrams, and instructions, including language about keeping women as sex slaves. The room did not need a long speech to tell a captive what it was for. A person brought into that trailer would have been receiving the message from every side at once, from what was hanging there, from what had been prepared in advance, from what was already waiting to be used. The tape did the rest. According to reporting, women were told they would be kept naked and chained, used repeatedly, and drugged heavily enough afterward that memory would blur. The recording did not merely threaten pain, it tried to get ahead of interpretation. It told a woman what had entered her life, what resistance would supposedly change, and why her own memory might later fail to carry her cleanly back out. Body and mind were being handled together. The restraints and devices controlled movement. The tape and wall instructions worked on expectation. A woman entering that room was meant to understand that she had entered something already built and already practiced. The split between the mobile home and the trailer mattered for the same reason. One structure belonged to Ray's visible life. The other was where that life narrowed into procedure. A woman could be brought onto the property, moved past the ordinary-looking part of it, and taken into a smaller room where the rules were already on the walls. Ron Lopez, the local district attorney, saw enough to call for help. The FBI joined in. State police joined in. What had started with one terrified woman at a neighbor's door turned immediately into a property search that demanded specialists, evidence teams, and a federal level of seriousness. Elephant Butte and truth or consequences mattered here as working geography. Ray's property sat near the lake. Desert ground and reservoir water would later become search terrain. The surrounding community was modest. Retirees, tourists, workers, park traffic, ordinary routines. Once Cynthia Vigil got out, the case was no longer unfolding in some sealed ruin far from daily life. It was unfolding in a desert lake community where a mechanic's property had turned into a multi-agency crime scene. The same landscape that had given Ray privacy became the terrain police had to search. The yard, the surrounding desert, the gullies, the water near Elephant Butte. Almost immediately, the March 1999 escape stopped being Cynthia Vigil's case alone. Another woman from the area told authorities she had been held at Ray's place for days and released only after promising to stay quiet. She had not escaped the way Vigil did. She had survived by convincing the people holding her that silence was more useful than resistance. Then there was the 1996 line. Investigators reviewing videotapes seized from the property saw distinctive leg and ankle tattoos on one woman being abused. That detail allowed them to identify and locate a Colorado victim years after the fact. The videos tied a hidden crime to a specific woman, a specific earlier period, and testimony prosecutors could use. The search widened fast after that, but not all at once. Leads were being generated from different directions at the same time. Vigil gave investigators a live scene and a named property. The earlier local woman gave them another captivity track on the same land. The videotapes pushed them backward toward a woman outside New Mexico, who could be found only because her tattoos gave the footage a nameable body. One witness opened the door. Another showed that the conduct was not limited to one night. Physical evidence produced a person who had not yet been part of the public file. Each confirmed line generated more questions. Who else appears on tape? Who used the property? Who traveled with Ray? Who can place him or his associates in other jurisdictions? Which items belong to known victims, and which do not? Contemporary reporting described more than 1,000 pieces of evidence and more than 100 leads. In practice, that meant more than a big pile of seized material. It meant cataloging objects one by one, sorting what belonged to the room from what might belong to women, linking videotapes to dates or identities where possible, and deciding which pieces could support actual counts in court instead of merely deepening suspicion. The geography expanded for the same reason. Once one victim was found through videotape in Colorado and the search around Ray began suggesting a wider history, state lines stopped being much protection for the file. Law enforcement followed threads into multiple states. They searched Ray's yard. They searched desert gullies and sandy ground around the property. They searched waters near Elephant Butte. Dogs trained to detect human remains were brought in. Equipment was used to probe the ground. No bodies were recovered in the searches documented here, but the method of the search showed what investigators believed the case might still contain. The names around Ray widened too. Cynthia Lee Hendy was on the property when Cynthia Vigil escaped. Early court proceedings made clear that prosecutors believed she had taken part in the crimes rather than merely watched them. Ray's daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Ray, was later charged in connection with one of the abduction cases. Dennis Roy Yancey, a known associate of Ray and Hendy, was charged in the death of Marie Parker, a 22-year-old woman whose disappearance had already become part of the expanding inquiry. By spring 1999, the public shape of the case had changed fast. A woman had escaped from a property that looked built for repetition. Another woman described being released into fear and silence. A Colorado victim could be traced backward through videotape. Associates and family members were entering the legal record. The story no longer looked like one allegation against one man. Before David Parker Ray became a national shorthand, he occupied a very local world. Elephant Butte Lake sat at the center of it. Water, desert, campground traffic, state park work, modest homes, and the nearby town of Truth or Consequences. Ray's property was close enough to the lake and far enough from public scrutiny to give him privacy. Contemporary reporting identified him as a mechanic for Elephant Butte State Park. That gave him a daily structure that looked useful and ordinary from the outside. He could leave for work, return home, move between the mobile home and the trailer beside it, and keep the hidden part of the property folded inside the same routine. A workday created windows. Morning departure could lower attention on the property because movement had an explanation. Evening return could look no different from any other worker coming home. Crossing the yard between the mobile home and the second structure would not necessarily announce anything to a passerby because the property already had a logic that belonged to him. Hendy made that routine worse. Cynthia Vigil's account placed her directly inside the 1999 abduction and captivity. She was there on the property when Ray was away. She was there when the closed world of the trailer still had to keep functioning. With Hendy present, the room did not go dormant when Ray left. A captive woman still had another adult to read, another source of threat, and another person keeping the line between the trailer and the outside world intact. The layout, the work schedule, and the accomplice presence worked together. The mobile home kept daily life visible. The trailer kept the core act separate. The job made movement on the property look ordinary. Hendy kept the routine alive when Ray was absent. The earlier local woman's account shows how that control could survive beyond the trailer itself. She said she had been held for several days and released only after persuading Ray and Hendy that she would not report them. The tape reportedly warned that memory would blur afterward. If a woman came out with gaps, fear, shame, and no confidence in the order of what had happened, the property did not need to hold her forever. The Colorado victim gave that same logic an earlier date. Investigators found her because videotapes seized from the property showed a woman with distinctive tattoos on her leg and ankle. When she later testified that a knife had been held to her throat and that she had been pulled by a dog collar like a leash, the pattern sharpened. The collar was there again. The threat at the throat was there again. The 1999 case had not appeared out of nowhere. When Cynthia Vigil encountered David Parker Ray and Cynthia Leah Hendy in Albuquerque in March 1999, she was already in a vulnerable position. Reporting described her negotiating a sexual transaction before being taken south to Ray's property near Elephant Butte. The opening of the 1999 case sits inside ordinary exposure, immediate need, weak protection, and a situation that still looked at first like something happening inside a city with other people close by. Albuquerque still held interruptions. There were streets, traffic, businesses, parking lots, the possibility that a shift in tone or direction might be noticed or questioned. Whatever Vigil understood then, the setting had not yet narrowed fully around her. Then came the early drive south. The urban frame began thinning. Distance accumulated before the full terms of captivity had to be spelled out. What still carried some ambiguity at the start became harder to read and harder to reverse once the city fell behind them. Midway through that drive, ambiguity became less useful. Longer stretches opened up, fewer interruptions, fewer people likely to notice fear, confusion, or a wrong turn. What had looked at first like movement from one place to another became transport toward his ground. The farther south they went, the more each missed chance ceased to be a chance at all. Arrival tightened everything further. First came the property, then the transfer across it, then the separate trailer beside the mobile home. Transport did not end when the vehicle stopped. It ended when Vigil was moved off the road, onto the property, and into the room already laid out for what came next. Inside was a space already prepared to take over the rest. The tape was ready. The walls carried instructions. The devices were already there. By the time she was in the trailer, the physical trip from Albuquerque had become something else. A controlled handoff from public space to private confinement. Inside that trailer, she had to read danger minute by minute. The room was already speaking before either of them had to improvise much. The collar, the nakedness, the tape, the walls, the threats, and Hendy's presence all worked at once. The first task was orientation, but orientation in that room did not mean understanding. It meant recognizing, very quickly, that the room had been designed so the terms of captivity would arrive faster than any safe response to them. The tape helped establish that first layer. According to reporting, it warned that the woman hearing it would be kept naked and chained, used repeatedly, and drugged heavily enough afterward that memory might come apart. The point was not merely to frighten her. It was to make the room feel complete before the next step even began. The tape told her that what was happening had happened before, would continue, and had already been thought through by the people controlling it. Then, the room moved from orientation to routine. Survivors described restraint, threats, humiliation, assaults with devices, and the steady use of fear to make compliance look like the safest path to the next minute. A captive was not being thrown into random violence. She was being moved through steps that looked familiar to the people running them. That familiarity is one reason the evidence later mattered so much. Restraints, instructions, and recording equipment all suggested repetition rather than improvisation. The bodily part of that routine was blunt. A collar did not just restrain. It changed posture, movement, exposure, and humiliation at once. Nakedness stripped privacy and made handling easier. Forced positioning and threats with weapons pushed in the same direction. The room reduced options until resistance itself became one more variable to be managed. Ray's work schedule fit into that routine in a way that made the captivity harder, not easier to understand from outside. If he left for work, the danger did not leave with him. Hendy was still there. The walls were still there. The tape was still there. The methods survivors described did not depend on one long, uninterrupted performance from one man. They could continue across hours, pauses, and shifts in who was physically present. Vigil had to keep reading the place for the smallest real difference between a pause and an opening. Is the threat for now or for later? Is stillness safer than speech? Is Hendy staying close because violence is rising or because ordinary watchfulness is enough? In a room built to punish the wrong move quickly, stillness could be the least dangerous action available. A misread could close the only exit. The tape reportedly warned that drugs would blur memory afterward. That detail matters because it extends the method beyond the room itself. A woman emerging with broken sequence, missing hours, and fear stronger than narrative is in a terrible position. She may know she was hurt. She may know she was held. But the shape of the experience can remain unstable long enough for shame, confusion, and doubt to do the rest. Memory became part of the crime here in a practical sense. If time can be damaged, reporting can be delayed. If sequence can be damaged, credibility can be attacked. Cynthia Vigil's value to the case was not that she remembered everything perfectly. It was that she got out while the case was still materially present around her. The split between the earlier local woman and Cynthia Vigil shows two different exits. One woman survived by sounding compliant enough to be released. Cynthia Vigil got out another way. Fear, disorientation, and the prospect of broken memory could preserve silence after release. A narrow shift in timing could make escape possible instead. Ray was away at work. Hendy remained on the property. That was the opening, but it was not safety. It had to be recognized first as a real break in the routine, rather than another variation inside it. If Hendy was still close enough, or if the chance lasted only seconds, moving too early could be fatal. Vigil had to decide whether the opening was real. That decision came before the road, before breach, before police. It happened inside the trailer while she was still within reach of the people who had been controlling her. A captive woman had to judge whether the room had finally loosened enough for action, or whether the appearance of looseness was only another trap. Then she moved. Once movement started, there was no neutral position to return to. Either she got farther than the trailer and the yard, or the break failed inside the system that had already contained her. During that narrow window, she fought Hendy, broke the sequence, and got out alive. Even then, the escape was not complete. Getting outside only changed the kind of danger. The property still had distance working for it. The trailer and mobile home were still behind her. Hendy still had to recognize a second too early or a second too late that Vigil was no longer trying to survive inside the system, but to get beyond it. The road was what mattered next. So was speed. So was whether the nearest occupied place would open. The image people remember is the collar and chain, but the immediate problem was more practical than that. Could she stay ahead of recapture long enough to reach another person and make that person understand, fast enough, that this was not madness or confusion, but an ongoing crime. She reached the road, still wearing the collar and chain that showed what she had just come out of. She reached breach before the sequence could close behind her. That is the hinge of the entire case. Had the opening been smaller, had Hendy stopped her, had the nearest trailer stayed closed, the room at Ray's property might have remained hidden longer, and the next phase of the investigation might never have begun in the same way. One woman leaves carrying silence. One woman leaves carrying visible evidence. Both outcomes belong to the same room. That difference helps explain how the property could stay hidden for as long as it did, and why Vigil's escape changed the case all at once. Once the immediate shock of the search passed, the case became a problem of proof. Investigators had to turn what they found at Ray's property into evidence that could survive hearings, trials, and cross-examination. Videotapes, restraints, written materials, tools, and the room itself were powerful. They still had to be tied to named women, specific periods, and acts a court could punish. The trailer could show preparation. The tape could show advanced scripting. The videotapes could identify bodies and methods. But none of those things alone could tell a jury where consent ended, when coercion began, who was present, or how a specific woman moved through a specific span of time on a specific date. The objects could establish design. The preliminary hearing in April 1999 was the first point where that distinction had to hold up in public. The legal question was not whether every suspicion around Ray had been proved. It was whether prosecutors had shown enough evidence for the major counts to survive and go forward. Associated Press reporting described District Judge Neil Mertz ruling that Ray must stand trial and that the evidence was sufficient to support charges, including kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and aggravated battery. That hearing also clarified the state's treatment of Hendy. AP reporting said the charges against her were reduced from 25 counts to 5 counts of conspiracy and being an accessory, with a proposed plea agreement tied to cooperation, and that she had waived a preliminary hearing. Even at that early stage, prosecutors were already shaping the case around roles, leverage, and testimony rather than treating every defendant the same way. The hearing offered the first structured public telling of what the women said had happened. It was not enough for the state to point at a trailer and ask the court to infer the rest. Women testified to abduction, chaining, sexual torture, and days of control. The evidence had to move from objects to bodies, from setup to sequence. In practical terms, prosecutors had to prove more than cruelty. They had to prove named women, named acts, time, place, coercion, and the defendant's participation. They had to show that what happened at the trailer was not consensual fantasy later redescribed as crime, not confusion born only of damaged recall, and not a set of disconnected allegations that happened to resemble one another. The defense did not need to make the trailer disappear. It only had to loosen the connection between the room and the counts in court. If a witness's timeline could be shaken, if memory gaps could be enlarged, if a specific act could be pushed into ambiguity, if an accomplice's role could be blurred, then the physical horror of the scene would not automatically produce convictions. Public testimony demanded the opposite of what the trailer had demanded. Instead of saying as little as possible, the women had to say enough. Instead of focusing only on the next minute, they had to hold whole sequences together in front of strangers. When were you taken? What happened first? When did the threats start? When did Hendy enter? When did Ray leave? What did the tape say? The burden of survival turned into the burden of order. That pressure did not fall on every witness the same way. The Colorado victim carried the earlier timeline. Investigators had found her because of the tattoos visible on videotape seized from the property. Her testimony about the knife at her throat and the dog collar at her neck placed an earlier woman inside the same method and gave prosecutors one advantage they badly needed. The 1999 case no longer stood alone. Vigil carried the center of March 1999. She connected contact in Albuquerque, transport south, the trailer, the tape, the collar, Hendy's presence, and the escape to Breach's door. Together, the Colorado victim and Vigil gave prosecutors what the case needed most. One witness line reaching back before 1999, and another witness line that ended in an escape while the scene was still recoverable. Physical evidence and human testimony were doing different jobs there. The room, the tape, the videotapes, and the restraints showed design. The women gave those things time, body, order, and consequence. Neither side was enough alone. Together they made the defense's preferred line harder to sustain. Even so, the case did not move cleanly from exposure to verdict. The prosecution first tried the 1996 Colorado case on its own, failed to close the matter there, and had to return to court in 2001. By that point, the legal fault line was clearer. The defense did not need to deny that disturbing things had been found. It needed to argue that the state still had not proved coercion cleanly enough, or had not tied every act to every count with enough certainty to convict. The issue was not whether the room looked bad. The issue was how far evidence and testimony could carry coercion past the defenses of fantasy, consent, and damaged memory. The state had to come back and make that link hold. When the prosecution returned in 2001, it came back with a harder structure. Jurors saw videotape evidence tying the Colorado victim to Ray's trailer. The victim herself described the knife, the collar, and the fear that she would be killed. The tape and the testimony were no longer floating separately. Each reinforced the other. The April 2001 conviction in the 1996 case changed the pressure around Ray. After that verdict, he was no longer facing the remaining prosecutions as a man surrounded only by allegations and a notorious search. He was already a man convicted by a jury in one of the cases tied directly to the property and the tapes found there. The conviction also clarified the prosecution's theory for the rest of the file. It was a cumulative case. Witness lines had to support one another without collapsing into each other. Physical evidence had to anchor testimony without replacing it. The state needed the jury to see recurring method, not just recurring horror. In June 2001, AP reporting described Cynthia Vigil on the stand, recounting how Ray had flogged her with leather whips and held her captive. Her role was larger than being the woman who escaped. She was the witness who forced the 1999 case to remain human and sequential once it entered legal procedure. Without Vigil, the March 1999 scene might still have yielded disturbing evidence, but it would have been far harder to tell the jury how that evidence connected to one living victim in one prosecutable case. She made the case speak in the present tense. She also made the jury confront the fact that what had been found at Ray's property was not a fantasy collection discovered in the abstract. A woman had survived that place and could describe how the evidence around her fit together. Even then, the perimeter of the case remained wider than the counts in court. On April 11, 1999, Dennis Roy Yancey was charged in the death of Marie Parker, whose disappearance in 1997 had been pulled into the widening investigation. That did not amount to a murder conviction against Ray. It kept the harder edge of the case close to the courtroom without resolving it there. By July 2001, Ray was no longer dealing with the case as an open contest. Reuters reported that one trial had already ended in conviction, that the plea deal was reached a week after the second trial started, and that part of the agreement reduced the risk that his daughter, Glenda Jean Ray, would serve prison time for her alleged role in one of the abduction cases. The plea changed the case in practical ways. It ended the need to litigate every remaining count through full jury verdict. It fixed responsibility on a narrower set of charges that the state could lock down immediately. It also meant some parts of the story would never be tested in open court as fully as they might have been otherwise. A plea can settle a legal outcome while closing off parts of the public record that only a full trial would have forced into detail. Reuters described Ray pleading guilty to one count each of kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and intent to commit kidnapping, along with a federal charge then described as white slavery. Whatever private calculations sat behind that move, the public effect was clear. The case shifted from contested proof toward final sentence, and Ray's room to maneuver narrowed sharply. The legal endgame moved quickly after that. On September 20th, 2001, Ray was sentenced to more than 223 years in prison on charges involving 2 women near Elephant Butte Lake. One earlier victim case had been dismissed as part of the plea resolution after that woman died of pneumonia in 2000. The remaining sentence was still enormous because the proven crimes were enormous: kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, aggravated battery, and related counts built out of prolonged captivity and torture. Both of the women whose cases drove that sentence were present at the hearing. The years were not abstract. The numbers belonged to living women who had survived long enough to hear the state describe what had been done to them in public and impose punishment for it. The accomplice outcomes clarified the record, rather than blurring it. Reporting from the sentencing phase says Glenda received time served, about 2.5 years, plus 5 years of probation. Hendy had entered the plea-driven logic of the case early and later served prison time for her role. By the end of 2001, the court record showed Ray at the center, Hendy as an active participant in the 1999 captivity, and Glenda linked to one of the abduction tracks. By the end of 2001, the record had fixed Ray's responsibility for prolonged captivity and sexual torture, and had fixed that the known cases involved more than one adult, helping the system function. What it had not done was convert every surrounding suspicion into courtroom proof. Marie Parker stayed on that unresolved edge. Her disappearance in the Yancey case kept the murder question near Ray without resolving it against him in court. Reuters also reported that, as part of the 2001 resolution, Ray agreed to be studied by FBI profilers. Even after conviction and plea, officials were still trying to understand the wider shape of the man they had in custody. David Parker Ray died in state prison in 2002, while serving the sentence that had effectively erased any chance he would leave custody alive. For the women in the proven cases, that mattered. The man convicted of kidnapping and sexually torturing them did not walk free. His death also narrowed what investigators could ever force out of him afterward. The unresolved side of the case did not die with him. In October 2011, the FBI, New Mexico State Police, and Albuquerque Police announced another coordinated search around Elephant Butte Lake for possible victims of David Parker Ray. Nearly a decade had passed since his prison death. The convicted offender was gone. Agencies were still going back into the same landscape. What remained were open disappearances, unresolved ownership of items seized in the investigation, and the possibility that some evidence still pointed toward women who had never been fully identified in public. The FBI's wording stayed careful. Ray had died in prison while serving more than 223 years. He had claimed to have abducted about 40 victims. Authorities still had not found bodies. Years after sentence and death, that was still the line between what had been proven and what remained open. The most concrete image from that later phase was the FBI evidence gallery, released the same year. 401 items, jewelry, clothing, personal effects, photographed one by one and put before the public because agents believed some of them might have belonged to victims. By 2011, investigators were no longer relying only on confessions, custodial leverage, or fresh witness memory. They were trying to move the file by recognition. A bracelet, a ring, a piece of clothing, a personal effect with no public owner could still generate a call, a family memory, or a name that the earlier case had never produced. The pictures did not look solved. Rings sat on white backgrounds without names attached in the public record. Bracelets were photographed alone, clasped shut, cut off from the wrists that had worn them. A blouse and other pieces of clothing survived as evidence numbers under hard light, while ownership remained uncertain. Earlier in the case, the public had a property, a trailer, witnesses, and search teams. In the gallery, the public was looking at the afterlife of the evidence itself. Not a room, not a defendant, just objects that should have been easy to return if every woman tied to the property had been fully identified. For families of missing women, that kind of release carries its own cruelty. A familiar object might mean recognition, it might mean a lead, it might mean nothing. The unresolved names remain specific. The FBI's 2011 search announcement named Jill Troya. According to the Bureau, Albuquerque police still had an open case into her disappearance after she was last seen the night of September 30th, 1995, or early the next morning at the Frontier restaurant in Albuquerque. The FBI said Ray was suspected of involvement in her disappearance and possible death. Connie belongs in the same careful category. In the FBI's 2012 public appeal, the Bureau asked for help from Australian authorities and the public in identifying a woman known only as Connie and locating an Australian man known as Mark, whose old letter had been found among Ray's belongings. The Bureau said Connie was believed to have disappeared in New Mexico around 1995 and might have been a victim of Ray. They kept the unresolved side of the case tied to actual disappearances, dates, and people. Cynthia Vigil later described herself on her website as a survivor, an author, and a founder connected to StreetSafe. Her name did not stay fixed only to the escape and the testimony. It ends back at the evidence table. 401 photographed items released because somebody somewhere might know which missing woman once wore them. Jill Troya, Connie, a man convicted and sentenced for prolonged captivity and sexual torture. Some lives continued in public. Some names remain in open files. The objects can be cataloged, stored, and photographed. The people attached to them still cannot all be returned so cleanly.